Good day, learners. Welcome to another lesson in general mathematics. Today, we will explore a very interesting topic, patterns and the Fibonacci sequence. When we hear the word mathematics, we often think about numbers, formulas, and calculations. However, mathematics can also help us recognize order and relationships in the world around us. Patterns can be found in numbers, nature, art, and even in objects that we encounter in our everyday lives. In this lesson, we will learn how to recognize these patterns, determine how they continue, and explore one of the most famous number patterns in mathematics, the Fibonacci sequence. Let us begin. Before we begin our discussion, I want you to think about this question. What do you see in nature that seems to have patterns? Look at the image of the flowers on the screen. You may notice similarities in their shapes, the arrangement of their petals, or even how the flowers appear across the field. Now think of other things in nature. Perhaps you have observed the arrangement of leaves on a plant, the shape of a shell, the structure of a spider web, or the patterns on the wings of a butterfly. What patterns have you personally observed? Take a moment to think about your answer. As we go through this lesson, you will discover that patterns are much more common than we sometimes realize. Before we proceed, let us look at our learning objectives. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe patterns in art and nature. You should also be able to determine the next term of a pattern and identify the rule that governs a pattern. Finally, you should be able to recognize Fibonacci sequences. Keep these objectives in mind as we proceed because they will guide our learning throughout this lesson. Let us begin by looking at patterns in nature. Observe the image on the screen. At first, we may simply see a forest filled with trees. But if we observe nature more carefully, we often discover repeated shapes, arrangements, and structures. Trees, for example, develop branches. Those branches divide into smaller branches, which may divide again. Leaves may also grow according to particular arrangements. Nature may sometimes appear random, but many natural structures actually show recognizable patterns. This is one reason why mathematics is useful in studying the natural world. Mathematics helps us describe the order that may exist behind what we observe. Let us look at a more obvious example. Observe the center of this sunflower. What do you notice about the arrangement of the seeds? The seeds do not appear to be placed randomly. Instead, they seem to form spiral patterns moving outward from the center. These arrangements allow many seeds to fit efficiently within the flower head. Sunflower seeds are one of the most commonly cited examples of patterns in nature. Later in this lesson, we will discover that certain natural patterns are connected to a special sequence of numbers. That sequence is called the Fibonacci sequence. Now look closely at this plant. Notice how the leaves appear to form a spiral arrangement around the center. Again, the leaves are not simply placed in straight rows. Instead, they appear to rotate around a central point. Spiral arrangements can be observed in many plants. Such arrangements may help leaves receive sunlight and use available space efficiently. The important idea for us is that nature frequently produces arrangements that are repeated or predictable. These are characteristics of patterns. Here is another fascinating example from nature. Observe the shell shown on the screen. Notice its spiral shape. The spiral begins near the center and gradually becomes larger as it moves outward. Similar spiral forms can be observed in different natural objects. When mathematicians study these structures, they examine how the size, shape, and arrangement change. Again, this shows us that mathematics is not limited to numbers written on a board. Mathematical ideas can also help us describe shapes and patterns that appear in nature. Now let us look at a honeycomb. What shape do you see repeated? The cells of the honeycomb form shapes that are approximately hexagonal. A hexagon has 6 sides. Notice how these shapes repeat and fit together with very little wasted space. The same shape appears again and again to form a larger structure. This is a very clear example of a repeating pattern. From sunflower seeds and spiral arrangements to shells and honeycombs, nature provides us with many examples of mathematical patterns. Patterns are not only found in nature. They are also widely used in art and design. Look at the image on the screen. Notice how the windows create a visual arrangement through their shapes, positions, and colors. Artists and designers often repeat elements such as lines, shapes, and colors to create order and visual interest. When an element is repeated according to a recognizable arrangement, we begin to see a pattern. This demonstrates how mathematical thinking can also be connected to artistic design. Patterns can also be seen in traditional crafts. Observe the woven object shown on the screen. Notice how the materials are arranged repeatedly to create the design. Weaving often requires careful planning. A particular arrangement may be repeated several times to produce the final design. If the arrangement is not followed correctly, the pattern may be disrupted. This means that the maker must recognize and follow a rule. In this sense, creating patterns in art is similar to working with patterns in mathematics. Here is another example of patterns in art. Observe the colorful textile designs. You can see repeated geometric shapes, lines, and colors. Triangles, diamonds, and other forms are repeated across the fabric. Although the designs may appear complex, they are often created by repeating smaller elements according to a particular arrangement. Patterns help artists create balance, rhythm, and consistency in their work. The same idea of following a rule will become important when we study number patterns. Now observe this circular design. Look carefully at the shapes around the center. Notice how similar elements are repeated around a central point. The arrangement creates symmetry and balance. If one part of the design were removed or placed incorrectly, we would probably notice that something was different. Why? Because our minds have already recognized the pattern. Once we understand the arrangement, we begin to predict what should appear next. This ability to predict is an important part of studying mathematical patterns. Let us look at another example of artistic patterns. These woven baskets contain repeated arrangements of materials. Notice the lines and alternating sections in the weave. Basket makers must follow a particular arrangement when weaving the materials together. The pattern is repeated until the desired shape and design are produced. So far, we have seen patterns in nature and patterns in art. Now, let us define more clearly what we mean by a pattern. A pattern is a repeated or predictable arrangement of numbers, shapes, colors, or objects. Let us focus on two important words in this definition: repeated and predictable. A repeated arrangement means that something occurs again. For example, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. The colors repeat. A predictable arrangement means that we can determine what is likely to come next based on a rule. For example, 2, 4, 6, 8. Even if the next number is not shown, we may predict that it is 10. Why? Because we have recognized the pattern. Therefore, recognizing a pattern involves identifying the relationship or rule that connects its parts. Let us now focus on patterns involving numbers. A number sequence is an ordered list of numbers arranged according to a rule. The word ordered is important. The position of each number matters. Consider the example: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. These numbers are called terms of the sequence. 2 is the first term. 4 is the second term. 6 is the third term. If we examine the sequence carefully, we notice that each term increases by 2. Therefore, the rule of this sequence is add 2. Once we identify the rule, we can determine the next term. Sequences may be classified according to whether they end or continue indefinitely. The first type is a finite sequence. A finite sequence has a limited number of terms. Consider the example: 5, 10, 15, 20. In this example, the sequence contains 4 terms. The sequence stops at 20. Because it has a definite or limited number of terms, it is called a finite sequence. The word finite simply means that there is an end. The second type is an infinite sequence. An infinite sequence continues without end. Consider the example: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Notice the 3 dots after 5. These 3 dots are called an ellipsis. In a sequence, an ellipsis indicates that the pattern continues. We can continue with 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. There is no final term indicated. Therefore, this is an infinite sequence. Remember, a finite sequence has a limited number of terms, while an infinite sequence continues without end. Now let us practice identifying a number pattern. Consider the sequence 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. Ask yourself, what is happening from one term to the next? From 2 to 4, we add 2. From 4 to 6, we add 2. From 6 to 8, we again add 2. Therefore, the rule is add 2. To determine the next term, we apply the same rule. 8 plus 2 equals 10. Therefore, the next term is 10. When analyzing a number pattern, always examine how one term changes into the next term. Once you identify the rule, apply that same rule to determine the succeeding term. Let us examine another sequence. 5, 10, 20, 40, and so on. At first, you might think that we are simply adding numbers. But let us examine the relationship carefully. 5 multiplied by 2 equals 10. 10 multiplied by 2 equals 20. 20 multiplied by 2 equals 40. Therefore, the rule is multiply by 2. To determine the next term, multiply 40 by 2. 40 multiplied by 2 equals 80. Therefore, the next term is 80. This example reminds us that patterns may follow different rules. Some sequences involve addition or subtraction. Others may involve multiplication or division. Our task is to carefully examine the relationship between the terms and identify the rule. Now we come to one of the most famous number sequences in mathematics, the Fibonacci sequence. Look at the sequence. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. At first, the sequence may appear unusual. Let us examine the rule. In the Fibonacci sequence, each new term is obtained by adding the two preceding terms. Let us see how this works. 0 plus 1 equals 1. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 2 equals 3. 2 plus 3 equals 5. 3 plus 5 equals 8. 5 plus 8 equals 13. Can you determine the next term? We add 8 and 13. 8 plus 13 equals 21. Therefore, the next term is 21. The Fibonacci sequence is special because its rule is different from the simple patterns we discussed earlier. Instead of repeatedly adding or multiplying by the same number, we add the two preceding terms to obtain the next term. This sequence is also often discussed in relation to patterns observed in nature, including arrangements found in plants and other natural structures. Let us summarize the important concepts that we learned in this lesson. First, patterns occur in art, nature, and mathematics. We observed patterns in sunflower seeds, plants, shells, honeycombs, woven materials, and artistic designs. Second, we learned that a number sequence is an ordered list of numbers that follows a rule. By identifying the rule, we can determine the next term of a sequence. Third, we learned that sequences may be finite or infinite. A finite sequence has a limited number of terms, while an infinite sequence continues without end. Finally, we studied the Fibonacci sequence. In the Fibonacci sequence, each new term is obtained by adding the two preceding terms. Patterns help us recognize order, relationships, and predictability. This is one of the ways mathematics helps us better understand both numbers and the world around us. Before we end, remember that mathematics is not only something that we see in textbooks or solve on paper. Mathematical patterns can be found all around us. The next time you look at a flower, a shell, a woven basket, a piece of fabric, or even a building, try to observe the arrangement of shapes and objects. Ask yourself, is there a pattern? What is being repeated? Can I identify the rule? Developing the ability to recognize patterns is an important mathematical skill because patterns help us describe relationships and make predictions. Thank you for your active participation throughout this lesson. Keep observing, Keep asking questions and continue discovering mathematics in the world around you. See you in our next lesson.